What didn't get into the book that maybe you wish did, or
Special issue of Dummy. What
yeah,
didn't get into the book?
we could do that.
Honest,
We
yeah.
could do that.
No, no, no.
Welcome to the Gummy Show. I'm John Kelly, publisher of Dummy, which is my zine about comics history that you can purchase at DummyZine.com. That's DummyZine.com. Issue 1 looks at the art of Pee Wee's Playhouse and focuses on the remarkable young artists who created the look and aesthetics of that great show from the late 1980s. Conversations with Gary Panter, Wayne White, Rick Heitzman, and people who also worked on the products of the show, Mark Newgarden, Kaz, and others. It's 44 pages of conversation and extremely rare images related to Pee Wee's Playhouse. You can also get issue 2, which looks at the strange story of the Air Pirates, who were a group of rebel underground cartoonists who in 1971 got into an awful lot of trouble with the Walt Disney Company for parodying their Mickey Mouse and other trademarked characters. It's filled with conversations with Dan O'Neill, Bobby London, Gary Holgren, Sherry Flanagan, and the late Ted Richards. A real in-depth look at the curious Air Pirates story. Why did they do what they did? What was going on in history at that time? There's also a look at some of the pre-Air Pirates Mickey parodies that were that led up to them. The Tijuana Bibles that featured Mickey Mouse, Wallace Woods, Disneyland Memorial Orgy, Mad Magazine's Mickey Rodent. I also talked to Robert Armstrong about his Mickey Rat character and Kaz about Creep Rat, and the wonderful Edwin Savage Pencil Pouncey interviews the legendary artist Stanley Mouse. It is a big issue. It's 92 pages. It's filled with all kinds of just amazing art and a lot of words too. And it's available at the Dummy Shop at DummyZine.com. On today's episode of The Dummy Show, I talked to Dan Nadel about this, his new biography of Robert Crumb, Crumb, A Cartoonist's Life. It's a great book. It's highly, highly recommended. As I said to Dan, I am so happy that he is the person who did this book because it's really a must read. It's wonderful. Even if you know a lot about Robert Crumb, and there's been a lot written about him, he's done a lot of interviews, he's certainly written a lot about himself, you will discover a lot of new things. There's been a great documentary made about Robert Crumb. You will learn more about him, and it's just a great read. It's just a really terrific book. I've known Dan for a while, and we have a lot of mutual friends. For a while, Dan was also my editor at the Comics Journal, and we talk about Robert Crumb, but the focus of the show, this episode, really, I wanted to know like how this all came about. Like, how did Dan get to this place where he was writing this book, and then what was it like writing this book? What was the process of writing it? Writing a book about a historical figure while that person is still alive. So I think there'll be a number of things that you'll see in this episode that you hopefully will find interesting. Some background information about how the process of the book unfolded. And we also talk about some of the projects that Dan is working on next, including a biography of the cartoonist Jack Kirby. I had a lot of fun talking to Dan about Crumb and other things for this episode, and I hope you enjoy it too. So here we go. Dan Nadel on Crumb on the Dummy Show. Oh, so how did this come about? Like, how did you get into comics? What is your backstory on becoming Dan Nadel? You write about art, and
Yes.
some of it's comics, right? A lot of it's comics, but it's not just comics, right? You write about interesting art. Certain comics are just interesting art.
Yeah.
I don't,
I write about, so I mean, professionally, yes, uh
and not just write. You curate. You put on
I
shows. You
write
put
a
out
lot
books.
about
You
art,
publish.
all sorts of visual art, including comics. I've probably published the most on comics, and I have curated a lot of exhibitions for galleries and museums on mostly primarily on modern and contemporary art, including a show coming up at the Whitney in 20, oh God, this year in September. That's a rethinking of the art history of the 1960s. So I, it's probably professionally kind of split down the middle between comics and the rest of visual art. And the origin story, so to speak, is is relatively straightforward. Like a lot of kids, I loved comics. Unlike a lot of them, probably I it just fit into my brain, starting with like Daredevil and the Avengers and Justice League and things like that. And this is, in Chevy Chase, Maryland, in the early 1980s. And I was just a fanatical comic book kid, and there was a really, as there still is, um, a solid, thoroughgoing like comics world of suburban Maryland that Gary Groff came from, much obviously much earlier, but also a guy named Joel Pollack who founded Big Planet Comics, which is where I worked when I was in high school,
Okay. I've
and
been there.
was
I was there just recently.
yeah. So Joel had known all the studio guys in the 70s and um, had been an art dealer for Wrightson and all those guys. Um, so I kind of had this education as soon as I graduated from like squatting at the pharmacy, looking at comic books, to going to the store and squatting there. Um, I started learning a lot, um, and I was very historically minded as a kid. I can't really say why. I guess I was like wired that way. So the Bethesda Public Library had a fabulous selection of all this sort of standard history books at that time, which were few and far between. There was like, a couple Ron Goulart books. There were the Blackbeard books, um, and things like that. And I just devoured those. And I just very early on, by the time I was like 11 or 12, I knew that there was this history that I really wanted to get at. And there were comic book conventions, weirdly, at a Holiday Inn within walking distance of my house growing up. And I think I started walking over there by myself when I was 12, maybe 11. Um, and those were almost every other month. So,
Wow.
or it felt that way. I don't actually know if that's true. That's how it seemed. And they had artists would come, and like I remember Mike Zeck being there once and John Beatty. Uh, those were like really, and I'd spend the entire day, with like $10, you just go and dig around. And I was a very obsessed kid with comics. And Big Planet recommended Mouse to me when I was, I don't know, maybe 12. Um, and that blew my mind. And at one of these conventions, the dealer asked me what I was into, and I said Mouse, and they said, "Well, why don't you try this?" And it was It was American Splendor by, Harvey P. Carr. And it was the first collection with the Crumb cover. And that just made perfect sense to me. It was just like, oh, this is the thing I've been waiting for, along, as well as Jim Lee's X-Men. Like, it's, I wasn't like it wasn't like an immediate door closing behind me. It was just like, oh, this is here too. Um, and and then soon after, I just dug it out actually. It's the 20th anniversary edition of Head Comics, which was published in 1988, and it has this fabulous new introduction by Crumb. Head Comics with this great intro, very long intro actually, incredibly long introduction. Um, and yeah, I mean that's what did it for me. And then I kind of went deeper into underground comics, and yeah,
So was American Splendor your first exposure to Crumb?
I think so. I'm pretty sure. I mean, that's what I've been saying, and I think it's true.
Yeah,
It's, yes, I mean that is definitely the first time I remember seeing it. Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, it was the fresh bread story. It's a one pager about smell of fresh bread. And that just kind of blew my mind.
yeah,
Uh, the fact that comics could do that was really remarkable to me. And yeah, I just needed to see more of it for some reason.
yeah. And then did you? I mean, did you begin seeking it out? You
Once
like
I got Head
was
Comics,
there a name recognition, right? So you're 12, so you could, it wasn't like reading um it wasn't like reading a Charlton story or something, right? So that the artists were identified, right? And you could
yeah.
tell you could tell that this is Robert Crumb because his name was
Yeah, yeah. I mean, somehow or other, well, from the time I was even younger than that, I think I subscribed to the Bud Plant comic art catalog.
okay.
And that had all sorts of tantalizing listings. Um, and I was also an avid reader of the Comic Buyer's Guide. And so somehow or other, I it must have been in CBG that I saw ads for Don Donahue and Bob Sidebottom, who were Donahue, of course, had been a publisher. I didn't know that at the time, but had been uh, the original publisher of Zap with Crumb. But later in the 80s, he was a dealer. He was a dealer of all this stuff. And so I spent a huge amount of my bar mitzvah money on Don Donahue's catalog, just forging you know, saying I was 18. And so I was just getting these shipments to, to the house of, it was like the Zaps and Man from Utopia was really, Rick Griffin's Man from
Yeah,
Utopia was really a big deal for me.
sure.
And probably some early, some Freak Brothers. I mean, all this stuff was sort of in beat up shape, but I remember ordering, and I don't know what my criteria was exactly, except that I think that Donahue sometimes would write little blurbs in the catalog that would be like, this is important or something. So I just got onto it, and then and I was interested in art in high school in particular, and was taking art classes at the Corcoran Gallery, and my dad took me to the National Gallery um, quite a bit. So it all just kind of was running in tandem. And it didn't occur to me that I had to ever choose. And that not having to choose was sort of confirmed the more into it I got, when I could sort of see that there was crossover between all these things, particularly like once I got to college, and it just seemed obvious looking around and talking to friends who are artists that there was no need to sort of choose between these things. Um, And I just kept going. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, was it okay with your parents that you had these underground comics?
I don't know if they knew.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, I was such a enormous. I was the kind of kid who was like so nerdy. I worked so I would go to. I think I would go to Big Planet on. I don't think on. I'd usually go on Sundays for the weekly new comics, but I was the kind of kid that would like come home with a stack of comics and spend the rest of the week reading those comics. So it's not like my parents ever knew what was in that stack per se. And I wasn't buying that stuff at Big Planet, but there was always sort of stacks of comics and I had long boxes and I mean, this was like anything could have been in those long boxes and my grades were good and it wasn't I was a pretty square kid.
Sure.
Uh, so, there wasn't really much to worry about. Uh, I just was just reading a ton. And yeah, I know it's funny to think about, but yeah, yeah, I was definitely looking at that stuff at a time when I totally didn't understand the implications of, Angel Food McSpade or all the sex stuff, or it just was just sort of for some reason it just sort of went right by me. Like I don't know why.
Yeah, I
Um,
think
and it was a different time too. I
it
mean,
was,
the other media, it's not like, Fast Times at Ridgemont High or Meatballs or Police Academy, all these things. It was all sort of like a little out to lunch. So underground comics didn't seem particularly transgressive to me at the time, given everything else that I was consuming. So
yeah, I would say like another big influence for me what was National Lampoon. And
yeah, see,
so
that was gone by the time I was of age.
yeah, there that was very intentionally um offensive to everything,
Yeah, that's
right?
right. That's right.
So so I think it took me a while. You were hinting at this, but I think it took me a while too to realize that some of this or a lot of this material was just like, oh shit, this is fucked up.
Yeah, yeah,
And
absolutely.
and then you become an adult and parent or like whatever. It's
Yeah.
just like, huh?
You start to realize that, wait a minute, like what's going on here exactly? Yeah, it took me a long time to sort of, it's a different thing when you're in it so fully, you're just immersed in it. Um, and you don't clock things that could really be hurtful to other people or particularly off.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I remember like being just this was after college, and it might have even been when I was at Sarah Lawrence at like at grad school, and I had some underground comic thing, and some student there took offense to whatever the content was. I don't remember
Sure.
what it was, right? And I was just like, really? And they're like, seriously, you don't get this? And I was
Yeah.
like, yeah, I guess I do. Yeah. I just thought it was no, I guess yeah, I see what you're
Didn't get
saying.
it.
I,
Yeah.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. It's funny that way. These things
Um,
that, yeah, they don't always register, especially for like white dudes who are only consuming this kind of thing for the most part.
yeah,
It's
it
just
is
not part of our radar.
right, right. My understanding is that when Robert agreed to, being interviewed and being the subject for the book, his request or demand or however you want to phrase it,
Yeah.
was that you address the topics that we're just sort of talking about right now.
Yeah.
The
Yeah, totally.
sexism and racism and the uncomfortable shit
Yeah.
that has led to some interesting. things in recent years.
Um, well, uh,
Well,
yes, I mean,
Robert had stipulations or demands. He wanted you to address the
Robert's condition. There were like a few conditions. One was that um, I give a fair airing to the accusations of misogyny and racism in the comics and really examine that earnestly. And the other was that I sort of not bother him too much. Um, and for me, like, it's interesting. A lot of art is difficult, and a lot of the art I most enjoy is very difficult to look at. So that goes to Peter Saul, and it goes to Jim Nutt or any number of artists. George Grosz, lots of people. H.C. Westerman, and or Aileen Kaminsky Crumb. Phoebe Gluckner. Like there's all sorts of work that is enormously rewarding that is difficult to sit with. It goes for comics, painting, sculpture, film,
Well,
uh,
it goes with literature. It goes with
literature,
yeah,
everything.
yeah. This
So the sort of diff quote unquote difficulty of it never really was an issue for me. The fact that he employed and then re-employed and then doubled down on using characters like an Angel Food McSpade or, you know, not publishing just one, but three issues of Snatch and then doing Jizz, like these sort of real provocations. In the early 90s, publishing, when the N-words, take over America, when the Jews take this, these are very intense pieces of art. And uh, his choice to use that imagery is charged because no matter what anyone says, the depths and intensity with which he used those things is far beyond what was normal in the 1960s. Everybody will talk about, well, the sensibilities were so blown out, and he was just one of many people pushing the boundaries, and he was, but there weren't that many other people, if any, pushing that hard with those sort of things, and clearly also like simultaneously satirizing, but also getting off on it, but also venting a spleen, but also holding up a mirror to America. It's all combined, and so that makes it complicated and difficult, but it has to be kind of examined because I think, I thought sort of in the book, Dewey Crumpler is an artist in the Bay Area at the time in the late 60s, a young artist who worked for the Black Panthers. He was very clear about it. He was like, it's interesting. He's as much the sim this he's as much like the symptom as he is the disease. It's his privilege as even if he was like a working class marginal white guy, he was still a white guy. So he still had that privilege to be able to make this work and walk away from it. Um, all of that, yes, but also, it is important to sort of show what the American psychosis is. And he did that. And the other thing is, well, some people would say, well, I don't want to see it because I can turn on the news and can see it all day long. And that's sort of two different things. That's neither here nor there for me. I want to see, I want to process these issues through art as well. Like, I don't want to just choose between, oh, the world is horrible. I want my art to be uplifting, or vice versa. So, um, so I just thought, to sort of take it head on. I don't, um, I don't think that it's wise, but it's everybody's choice, as it was Robert's choice to make the work, and to allow it to be republished and to kind of, uh, if not stand behind it, then not suppress it. Uh, it's his choice to do that. He's a big boy, and frankly, like things like the SPX thing or mice or these sort of instances that people really only within a very small subsection of comics, of which you are a part and I am a part. Um, Nobody outside that subsection knows what SPX is, let alone that there was a controversy. And moreover, um, who cares? Like I don't like I think it's important generationally that younger artists push against the older artists. It's part of, you know, understanding history and dealing with it. What, but I wasn't going to give that stuff any air because it feels completely irrelevant to Crumb's career, the arc of his life, and his influence. Because while the influence may have waned and been a little bit, touchy at places like SPX, um, it has only increased in the rest of the culture. And that says a lot more about how insular and kind of backwards the that comics culture is than it does about Crumb. Like the fact that I couldn't give a talk at SPX this year about Crumb, but that I was on the cover of the New York Times book review for that book, that should tell you a lot about the problems we have with comics and its infrastructure and the way it deals with history. Because the fact is, like, I think it's fine. You want to dismiss the work, totally cool. But to dismiss it without, really understanding it or giving it a fair shake seems awfully short-sighted and kind of an example of some of the problems that have come up with how the sort of intellectual scaffolding around comics exists, which is, pretty shaky. I mean, I think what's interesting, and this is like a side note, but something I've talked about with like Sammy Harcum or Frank Santoro for years, is that on some level, like you don't want to be stuck in those zones. You want to sort of have a cultural life outside of those zones. And if you're stuck there, then you're really stuck. And that's what it is.
It's an odd side note to a long career that if you had,
Is it even a side note?
well, an asterisk, I don't even know what
I
you would
don't even
call it.
think it's an asterisk.
It's
I
probably
guess
not.
my point
It's
by saying that was to say it literally has no importance.
Mhm.
Like it doesn't affect book sales, it doesn't affect me, it doesn't affect Crumb. All it's doing, the only impact it has is is sort of is uh further cordoning off a little part of comics that will just continue to be kind of inbred and um, unambitious. That sounds a little harsh, but I kind of mean it.
okay.
Because I think it's important, like you want to be expansive, not closed,
Hmm.
ideally, as an artist or as a publisher or anything really. And that means looking at difficult things sometimes.
Sure, 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 sure.
That's life.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing, and this is a side thing that I don't think will make it into whatever we're doing, but I'm assuming that whatever my audience is, it's people like you and people like me and people our
Yeah.
age, whatever. But it turns out that when I go to these shows, these conventions or festivals or whatever they are,
Yeah.
or get contacted by people who are liking my posts or making comments and stuff, a lot of times a good number of them are much younger,
Oh, good.
which surprised me.
Yeah.
Um,
There was a time not that long ago when if you were in your 20s or 30s and looking to kind of have a broader vision of comics, let's say, you could, for a little while, you could pick up Comic Art Magazine or print issues of the Comics Journal. And there was also a smaller but much more cohesive sense of this sort of oncoming rush of reprints. There's the Seagar stuff, or
Sure.
which I'm just seeing behind me. Um, and there was a sense of this sort of there was the Masters of American Comics show, whatever you thought about that, that was a thing. Um, there were my books about the history, and I guess what I'm saying is there was a sort of uh, a vision of the past that you could key into with some ease, and that's not really being served anymore. I mean, there is a comics journal, but it comes out irregularly, and it's not that anymore. Um, you're the clo I mean, you've only published one issue. I subscribed. I'm still waiting for the second one.
Went to the printer today. Like literally, like right before we got on the phone.
Hit the button.
I let, yep.
No, but I mean, I think that's probably why people are coming up to you. Like there's not a place to go for sort of deep dives into the history anymore. And the books that are coming out are coming at you from all directions. They're not coming at you with like, here's a curated selection of X, Y, and Z, or it's much more uh catch as catch can, which is funny, but I think we have sort of reached this sort of chaos moment. Um, and the people that were driving a lot of that stuff, are have retired or died, or whatever. Like it's a different moment now, and I think that's partly what people are finding in you and Dummy.
You know, as you know, doing something the right way takes a long time.
Oh, I know, I know. Tell me.
Um, there are people who write books in 6 months, right? And
Yes.
okay, sometimes they can be good, I
Yeah.
guess, you know.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Um, it took you 6 years
Yes.
to do this, and was that the right amount of time?
Was that the right amount of time? Was that the right amount of time? It was for me in my particular circumstances. I mean, let's see. If there is a version of this whole process that's probably like 3 or 4 years, um, but COVID happened, and so I couldn't get to France for the first. I got Robert agreed to the book in November of 2018. Then he came to New York in early 2019, and I interviewed him and Aileen
Oh,
for a long
for
time.
the book of Weirdo.
No, no, he came back, I think, that same year.
Okay, so
No,
that
he
was in
came,
October.
yeah, he came in early 2019 for a gallery exhibition, and then in October of 2019, he came for Weirdo, and I interviewed him again, him and Aileen again when they were here for that. Then COVID happened, and I couldn't get to France until the fall of 21. So I lost a lot of time, and I also didn't exactly know what I was doing. So I spent a huge amount of time interviewing people, 150 or more people, and huge amount of time processing and just reading and reading and reading. So yeah, I mean, for me, that was the time it took. I don't know if it was the time I needed. I also couldn't seem to stop doing many other jobs. I was employed at a museum at University of California, Davis during that time, um, and then at the Lucas Museum, and then did a show at the MCA Chicago. So it was like it was a lot of and working on a show at the Whitney the whole time. So I wasn't able to really shut things off in the way that I will in the future. And yeah, it was sort of like that was the time it took. And I was far too conscious of all the things I thought I needed to read before I interviewed Robert. Like I really took his "Don't bother me too much" probably too seriously.
Yeah.
And so I really wanted to not ask him questions that had already been asked. And for a guy that's been interviewed for years extensively, that was not easy.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing though, because you're choosing a figure who, I mean, I've read a lot about him. I've read a lot of interviews. I've read a lot of pieces. I know for a fact that you've read a lot more than I have, which, um, is a lot.
It's much.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Or
whatever. But
yeah.
it's an interesting thing in that it's a process and you're doing it about somebody who's still alive, right? So you have two different things there, right? There's one, you have the opportunity to ask questions that you um, may ponder as a result of all of the research and
Mhm.
reading, as opposed to, in the other case, just writing about from what material that you were able to put together, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, in any situation, you're going to have to do a lot of interviews. That having the subject there added a whole other layer because Robert could clarify a lot. He could analyze with me. He could contradict things. He could um, also point me to specific things in his archive that I otherwise may not have clocked entirely. Um, so yes, I mean, having him alive also meant, there were people in his life that I had no idea about that are never mentioned in any published sources that he pointed me to. Um, and having him also, or not having him, but knowing that he would ultimately read the thing was a whole other level of anxiety
Sure.
because um, obviously I look up to or admire is too strong a term, but like I have an enormous amount of respect um, and then ultimately affection for him. Uh, but so an enormous amount of respect for his intellect and his judgment. So knowing that that kind of searching precise consciousness would be examining my book about him, and also that that consciousness is such that he's spent, you know, how old is he? He's 81, so let's call it 65 years relentlessly examining himself and writing or drawing his own history. it's it's daunting. Yeah. Um, so it was like a blessing and a curse. It meant that he was always in my head. Like I could hear him in my head, and I could uh on the other hand, I could call him up and say, "Hey, your sketchbook says this, the letter to Jay Lynch says this, so and so remembers this. How do we make sense of this? How do we make a sense of the contradictions here?" And kind of unpack it with them occasionally. That didn't always work because nobody, even Robert, doesn't remember a contradiction from 1971. But at least I could say, well, okay, what did the apartment, okay, we can't totally unpack it, but maybe you can give me a few more pieces of information to unravel the idea or the truth here. So yeah, and I mean, and then also things like you asked me to bring some props to the interview. So one of the things he sent me far that I came across in a letter, and then he was like, "Oh yeah, you should probably have that." Was this, which is um, a calendar he began making in 1999, in which he recapitulated his entire life month by month. Um,
Starting when?
Starting when he was born, 1943. See here in August 30th, I am born. Here's 1987, month by month.
It's
So
like a reverse diary that he.
that that's right. And here are his notes for that calendar. So this sort of stuff was incredibly helpful. Um,
Well, what was he basing the references on? Like
so he
just
did his own research into his own archive. He, first of all, he has an incredible memory, um, because he's been remembering to remember things since he was a teenager. Like I don't remember much at all from my life because I don't spend any time remembering things. It's not something I do. Um, I have friends who do spend that time. I don't. Um, I'm busy remembering other people's lives. So,
yeah,
uh, but Robert's been remembering to remember for years and years. Then he's been, you gotta, the guy was being interviewed very early on and was writing introductions starting in the 80s to his work, right? So in the 80s, he's only in his 40s. And,
yeah.
and then he has had his own sketchbooks in which, the published sketchbooks are sort of deceptive because they don't include, wait for it, I have examples. They do not include things like this, which is this is like a 20 page, sorry, like, or this, pages and pages of writing are in the original sketchbooks, but not in the published sketchbooks. So there's a lot of diary writing that happened over the years. And at a certain point, he started keeping copies of his own letters. So he was able to assemble that calendar from his own archive. Now, nevertheless, I I still found a lot of things that were incorrect, and but whatever, pretty damn good, pretty good. Yeah.
Uh, do you have any sense at all of are there what are the plans for those
For the archive?
materials? Yeah.
Oh, it hasn't been announced yet, but it's Robert's made a decision that I hope he's made a decision that I worked with him on, and I can't. I'm not allowed to say.
Oh, I'm not asking you to.
It's a great decision. It's the perfect decision, and I hope that the people that are ultimately, you know, Robert's going to be around a long time. Down the road, I hope that his decision is respected, um, and it would be a boon to everyone involved.
Good. Good.
It's all being, I mean, if all goes according to plan, it's all being kept together and it's going to the right place. And yeah, and with people that are the right people and understand the work and understand him
well, but do you have enough room at your house?
and happily, happily, I am not involved. I'm moving on, baby. Moving on,
Um,
sort
you,
of,
well,
almost.
you are, but that's, I mean,
I mean, you had asked because I had mentioned in a couple interviews that he corrected my manuscript, and you said,
well,
uh,
that's the thing I really wanted to say. Yeah.
yeah. So I printed out a few pages. So what he would do is, um, I mailed him a printout of the whole manuscript back in, well, whatever it was, March or April 2024, and he would mark up the manuscript by hand, and then his assistant would scan it and send me PDFs. So most mornings for the month of May 2024, I would get things, that looked that on like the easier side of things looked like this.
Okay.
So just, sometimes just stylistic suggestions because he couldn't help himself. He's just too compulsive. Um, and other things. where he would sort of rewrite my descriptions of, let's say, like color separations.
Okay.
Um, and then other times when he would sort of embellish an anecdote quite a bit, adding more detail. And this was all up to me to take or leave, you know. He wasn't as long he had approval over facts, like he obviously was allowed to fact check the thing, but a lot of his stylistic choices, you know, some of them were good. Robert's a good editor. He's a really good writer. So some of them I took, some of them I didn't. But that's the kind of thing I would get. And sometimes, you know, I'd have a nice sigh of relief when a page came back only looking like this. Um, you know, so it just sort of depended on what he caught. And nevertheless, some mistakes still made it into the book. I mean, as with any nonfiction or fiction book, there's always going to be errors that slip in, like this sort of mortifying. Uh, Aileen referred to Joey Bishop, and somehow through multiple rounds of manuscripting, it became Jose Bishop. You know, like what can
Oh,
you do? You know, things
yeah.
just happen with something that's 110,000 words. It's just mistakes slip in, um, especially when you're going through like multiple copy editors and then the final proofing. It just things happen, but mostly I'm correcting most of them for the soft cover, which will be out. I guess maybe in a year, maybe like a year this time. I'm not sure.
Well, will it be just a reprint of the
Yeah.
hardcover book or
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, with some errors fixed. Yes.
Sure, no that,
But
but
no expanded, no. I don't, you know, honestly, like it's been funny. I had a really lovely visit yesterday with Patrick and Karen McDonald, of Mutt's fame. And it was this wonderful day. I went out to see them and talk about Jack Kirby with them and also George Harriman. And I got back home. They're in Princeton. I live in Brooklyn, and I got back home and I started thinking about Crumb again for a minute because I'm going to edit a series of books for Fantagraphics, reprinting kind of fact as though it's always hard to, I got to figure out a better elevator pitch way to say this, but essentially like faux facsimiles of the comic books, as though you were getting bound volumes of Robert's solo comic books. Um, and I have to start, you know, writing the introductions. And after a really like uplifting day with with Patrick and like talking about Kirby and Harriman and these much more sort of up uh, artworks and much more sort of um, joyous, I suppose, things. It was funny to come back and think about Crumb and think like, oh God, I have to go back to that mindset. Like I have to go back to that. I was in that mind for so many years, and he was in mine. Um, that it's a little daunting to think about going back there. And it was sort of a relief to be done. But I mean, it's fine, you know, whatever. It's great stuff, and so I'll go back. But and it doesn't have to be as intense. But what you were about to say is like, will there be extra material? I just can't imagine um, doing that right now. It's just like beyond.
I understand that. I understand that completely, but I also understand in any time that well, I don't know. I can only talk for myself, I guess, but anytime that I'm writing something that's, you know, I'm thinking of the definitive history of something, right?
Yeah.
There's 9 million other things that don't get in
Yeah.
there,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. Yeah.
That
Yeah.
could be in a, could be in an expanded volume, but eventually you have to stop at some point, right?
You have to stop. And you also have to stop in a way, like the reason the book is the way it is that it was really important to me. Like, listen, I knew that like you and like whatever certain people that we're friends with would read like a 600-page version that read like a list or like I know that there's an appetite for the endless data points and but I really wanted it to work. That wouldn't have served him or me. I really wanted to write a good book, and a lot of books about comics are full of good information, but they're not good books, or they're full of interesting ideas, but they're not good books. And I really wanted it to be as good a book, uh, measured against, the best, my favorite, or the best biographies or the best nonfiction. And that was the goal. And I really wanted it to be a compelling narrative that somebody that was not already into Crumb or comics could pick up and read and get a lot out of.
Yeah.
Otherwise, there's sort of no point. And there's a version, yeah, there's like a way that I could imagine repurposing all the work that got cut. Um, but that would take months and months and months of work. And uh, it's not like there's big chapters that are just ready to go out into the world. I mean, I would much rather see, but this is complicated for all sorts of reasons. It's not really worth getting into, but like I'd much rather see like a compilation of Robert's writing or uh I guess what I'm saying is I'd rather see like supporting materials brought into print than my like extra thoughts about American greetings.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
If
totally
that
get that.
makes
And
sense.
I,
Because I
I,
also
I
know, I mean, Crumb's an artist for the age. Like, if the book has done anything, then or if like the book has done a good job, then there should be people wanting to fill in those gaps. And I don't know if there are. I have no idea, but I hope so. And I wish there were more things like the Book of Weirdo, or things like that, where there are these sort of deep, deep, deep dives that function as resource books for people to then build upon.
sure, 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 sure.
Yeah, so it's sort of like thinking about the sort of larger scheme of comic scholarship. Um,
But there's any number of roads that you could have gone down, right?
I went down most of them.
Right, but to focus the story on, right? I'm thinking of my experience when the Crumb movie came out,
Oh yeah,
right?
yeah,
To me, I saw the movie. I was like, wow, this is a great movie about an artist, right?
mhm. It sure
Um,
is. Yeah,
and the reactions of the people who I was with or friends of mine who saw it were like, "Oh my God, that's so fucked up. What a
yep,
fucked up family." Like
yeah,
that's so crazy. And I went, "Huh, actually, that's the tip of the iceberg." If you want to know about his family, that
yeah, yeah, yeah,
really doesn't, if you think that's bad, wow. Uh,
yeah.
because
True.
I remember, the Gary Groth interviews with him in the Comics Journal,
Yeah, yeah,
that had come out several years before that.
yeah,
Um, that was mind blowing to me.
yeah,
That reading
yeah.
those.
Oh yeah, totally.
Um, and then the movie was like, oh, there's his brother, there's Charles, there's Maxim.
Yeah,
Um, so like things are connecting, but it wasn't like a shock or anything. It was like, oh, they don't really go into it, was my reaction. It was like, oh, they just touch upon it.
yeah. I think
But
yeah,
you could have done a book about that, or there's any number of
absolutely. But
other things you could have done.
my goal really was to dignify him as one of the all-time
Sure.
great American artists. And part of it is I knew that the obviously I knew the film existed, and I have a huge amount of respect for the film and for Terry. Um, but all these things, as you know, these things are guided by sensibility to a large extent. Like it's not like we're, you know, objective robots who can sort of decide on something and execute it. Um, I
Well,
am, and
there's a
I
million there's a million factors that goes into,
yeah, so much
especially
of it is
making a
personal.
documentary movie. There's like what people are willing, who you're able to get, like, you
But
know.
also, I will say, I think a lot of it is about your sensibility
Hmm.
and your sensibility and your what your ultimate goal is, and also your openness to being surprised. Like I was enormously surprised primarily by some of the women that Robert knew in the 60s and 70s, whose interviews were easily the best in the book. Um,
Yeah.
and I was most interested in kind of following him. As a friend of mine gave me good advice early on. He said, just pretend you're a camera right behind his head. Just follow him. Don't worry about, you know, I don't mean this literally, but like, don't worry about S. Clay Wilson. He's going to take a left. You're following Robert up to Potter Valley and, you know, then into the Central Valley. Like, you know,
Yeah.
and so that was my take. And I don't have Terry's sensibility. I don't have Groth's sensibility. Like I'm a much different kind of brain. And, I am a different generation. Like I just, it could have gone all sorts of different ways. The book to me feels extremely personal to the way I think about things and also the way I felt was important to position him and the people I found and the stories I was most interested in telling. Um, and also sort of being very blunt about the difficulties involved in his life and the difficulties of Maxon and Charles and whomever else.
Well,
Just felt like I needed to account for that, and I really, really wanted to push against the sort of glorification of these like groovy dudes in the 60s and 70s and Zap and all this stuff. I am so sick of that. Um, and and I also don't think it's actually terribly interesting. Like as a take that they were like the greatest and the badasses, like this sort of thing, or you know, these guys were breaking down barriers, and they were, but lots of people were, and you know, like you know, to sort of take a wide angle and sort of think about how this sits within the larger culture instead of just oh boy, you know, they got to draw fucking in comics for the first time. It's kind of like it's important as a fact, but it's not important as a philosophy.
yeah.
And it's much more interesting to me to think about like you get how Robert could open up a door for artists as different as like Mike Kelly and Trendle Hancock and Dan Clowes. Like that is a more interesting vision of the sort of expansiveness of his work and how much we can take from it and how much there is to draw from, how much sustenance there is to draw from. I mean, there's only a few artists who could do that, and he's one of them. So that's yeah. So like I was coming at it from that perspective as opposed to like needing to do something else, whatever that other thing is.
Well, I'm very glad you did what you did. And again, as I said earlier, I'm glad that you're the person who wrote this book, that you know,
What if I wasn't?
well, we wouldn't be talking. You might, I don't know, we may or may not have been having this
What if
conversation.
what if I told you right now that someone else wrote the book? But
Oh, Jerzy Kaczynski.
that's right. That's right. That's right.
You had the AI do it.
No, no, no. It wasn't even the AI. It was who knows? Who knows? We'll never know.
Okay, well, you made the right choice then, whoever you had
No, I mean yeah, it
as your
was
surrogate. You're Let me, you were saying that, the choice of the women that in his life, that was a surprise to you. They're what they had to say about him. I found that interesting in reading the book. And I was wondering also, what are some other, I have a couple of other questions, but what are some other surprises that, I mean, when you read a lot about all of the existing material about a
Yeah,
subject, right?
yeah.
You don't you don't necessarily think that you know everything about it, or that you're an expert, but in a way you're like, well, what else could there be?
What
Like,
else could there possibly be? I know, the surprises, the biggest surprise, and was that the guy I encountered, I was talking about this with somebody the other day, like the guy I encountered and spent a lot of time with is not the guy in Terry's film, and he's not the guy on paper. He's a different guy.
yeah,
And that was a profound surprise that I could sit with him and just sort of hang and have very interesting conversations, and that he was very warm and generous, and probing, and that guy was is not present in a lot of the materials, and not for any fault of any of the people who made that work. It's it's that I'm encountering somebody first in their late 70s, and now he's 81. Um, so people change, and he has allowed himself to change and to grow, and he has allowed himself, and I think not allowed, but actually, I shouldn't say he's allowed himself to change. He has actively sought to um, continue growing as a human being, and as an artist, in a way that I think few people do, period. Certainly few cartoonists in that generation did. Um, and so I found this other person, and that was very moving to me and meaningful. And I guess that was the biggest surprise. The women that I spoke to, and it sounds so strange to categorize them that way, but I did speak to, girlfriends, and of course talked to Aileen a lot. And I read her diaries, and um, Robert's complicated. He could be a total asshole and really horrible, and like fuck around on people. And yes, it's an open marriage, but that doesn't mean that somebody's not going to get hurt, emotionally. And so, but for the most part, everybody felt very warmly towards him because he did to them what he kind of did to me in a way, which is that when Robert's extremely charismatic, and as I said, very sort of focused and warm. And when he is focused on you, the sun shines. And that's an unusual talent that I've encountered once before in my life. Um, I know somebody else who felt it with another artist as well, but it's very rare. And yeah, so I could kind of understand what they, obviously not sexually, but I could understand emotionally almost what they felt, and in terms of his warmth. And it's genuine. He's in the moment. It's warmth. So, the girlfriends and things, the surprise was that they all had an enormous amount of affection for him and love, and had very fond memories. So for all the sort of I'm a creep, uh, I'm an asshole-ness of his comics, that's not how he's remembered by the people he was actually involved with. And that's interesting, that kind of that led me in part to this sort of idea of him constantly tempting fate by depicting himself in the worst possible way, despite evidence to the contrary. Um, so that was surprising. And you know, the other lovely surprise was that he was much more embedded in the various countercultures of America than I thought. That, you know, he was he did his imagery was in like poetry, mimeograph zines in the 60s before Zap. That, you know, there's a connection to the sort of old beatnik culture and to the Greenwich Village culture, and then there's connections out uh, to to you know Coevo Quarterly and sort of environmental activism. You know, there was much more of that, of those connections than I expected, and I was also really struck by how involved he was in nurturing generations of cartoonists. And that doesn't really come through in the public persona,
Mm.
but you know, from Zap to Weirdo to Mineshaft to, you know, these things are he wants this form to continue.
Yeah.
And there's an involvement there that, you know, with the exception of Spiegelman, like there's not many other cartoonists who took the form in hand in that way over so many decades, you know, to continue nurturing cartoonists and obviously in very different ways. Um, but tell you what was fun. Um, the day Robert was here for a few weeks, and I don't think they'll mind me telling a version of this. Uh, Robert was here for a few weeks, and on the day he was leaving, I was taking him to the airport at the end of April, and he hadn't had time yet to have like a one-on-one lunch with Spiegelman. And of course, these guys have known each other, what, since the late 60s, um, since 68. And so I had to take Robert to the airport. So he said, well, come to lunch with me and Art. And I've known Art a long time. So I had lunch with the three of them. And I mostly was just like really quiet. You know, I didn't want to interrupt that. And it was very sweet because for a minute, just for a minute, I could see what their dynamic might have been 55, 60 years ago. No, not 60, 50 years ago. Um, and it was very much like they were encouraging each other and kind of, I think at times they had been competitive and probably it wasn't as warm. But it was very warm and sort of these old masters kind of saying, "Oh, you're still like." Robert looked at Art's new work. He was like, "Oh man, that's great! Like, keep going with that." And Art saying, you know, to Robert that he was really looking forward to the new work, and you know, it was just this sort of beautiful uh, surprise on some level because you forget that these guys were once in their early 20s and excited to see each other's stuff.
Yeah.
And they still are, you know, it's like, wow. You know, it's and because it's who they, you know, they are who they are,
Right.
but their enthusiasm is undiminished, which is
Mm.
kind of amazing. Like they are jaded in many ways, those guys. Um, but when it comes to like, hey, what are you working on? It's just it's 1968 again, basically.
Yeah, they're in high school or whatever.
It's pretty cool. That was really quite wonderful.
Huh.
Yeah. Anyway, I've been blabbing. What else? What else?
Well, I just what didn't get into the book that maybe you wish did, or
Special issue of Dummy. What
yeah,
didn't get into the book? You
well, we
know,
could do that.
honest,
We
yeah.
could do that.
No, no, no. Things that didn't get into the book. Oh, I had more on American Greetings that I was had a lot of fun with. Um, you know, the personalities involved in American Greetings were super interesting.
That
And
that I mean, that would make an amazing issue of Dummy. just looking at that art that art has never really been reproduced in the right
You
way.
know, it's funny. It is one of the last like Crumb art book projects that has not been done. I don't know. I think that at some point when American Greetings was still sort of a thoroughgoing concern,
Yeah.
the rights were an issue, but the rights are not an issue anymore.
Yeah, I know. I know. That's my understanding of it too. So,
Somebody should do it. And that's a great era. And also Robert's really good friend from that time.
yeah.
John Gibbons was a writer at American Greetings, brilliant guy, who was also good friends with Ward Kimball,
Okay.
who was one of the great Disney
Yeah,
animators.
of course. Yeah.
Um, I have a whole folder of their correspondence. It's quite fun. So there's interesting connections around that zone of things. Uh, I went much deeper on like the early days of the print mint than space permitted. I had to cut out all sorts of stuff about this moment in the late 60s when when oh God, a woman named Betsy Klein who worked at Peaside Bookstore and then was involved with Ken Weaver, the drummer for the Fugs, when they separately but sort of together moved from the East Village to Tucson. And this was part of like a new age relocation funded by Peggy Hitchcock in part, who had right before that funded Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert at
Okay.
Millbrook. So there was a kind of fascinating Tucson scene that Aileen was a part of, and that's just interesting to me. I wrote more about that that got cut out. There's so much more about Aileen, of course, that could be done. Um,
Well, did her death derail or did it
Derail things.
well, I don't know if derail is the right word. I didn't want to did
Well, no, I mean
did it change things?
it changed the whole shape. It changed the shape of the last chunk of the book, certainly. I mean it and unfortunately, like I had interviewed Aileen a lot, maybe 20, 25 hours, maybe more. And I'd read a, a lot and did afterwards as well. But there were a lot of things that I had not asked her, in part because I was following that rule, which I will never follow again, which was if this person has been asked this question, I'm going to try not to ask it again. I'm going to rely on the sources that were published, and I shouldn't have done that because it inhibited some conversations that I should have just had. But I was trying to be really respectful of their time. So I had planned to do a lot more interviews with Aileen that may or may not have impacted the book. I don't know that they would have, but in my head, I was thinking, well, okay, I'll get this done, and then I'll write a shorter kind of monograph on her. And that I don't think is going to happen now because I don't know that there's enough material that I have. And also, I think I may just need a break from that world. Um, but yes, it changed things. It did. Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, what can I say? Yeah. But it's not as though I hadn't interviewed her yet. That would have been rough.
Oh, sure. Yeah,
I
yeah.
had spent a good amount of time with her.
Um,
Aileen as a person, um, and as a mind was much, much more familiar to me from growing up than Robert. So it was sort of a sensibility that I'm in some ways a lot more at home with than I am with his.
well, such a warm person, and
It's the East Coast Jew, New York Jew thing. That's just part of my DNA.
yeah.
That's all. It's sort of like I know that person, sort
Well,
of.
I could say as somebody who's an East Coast non-Jew,
Yeah,
like just having met her over the years,
it's
just
that.
she's just was such a wonderful person,
Yeah, totally.
I liked her very much.
Yeah, me too.
Obviously, I wrote a couple of pieces,
Yeah.
for she did mean a lot to me. not just her art, but her tenure during Weirdo,
Oh yeah, I mean, and Weirdo.
and then
God.
just the personal experience of having conversations with her.
Yeah, totally.
There's more we can certainly talk about for hours, but I wanted to not.
For hours.
Well, we could. I
We
mean,
could,
but
that's true. We could really go in there.
or we could talk about lots of different things for
Totally.
hours. But um, the next book is on. I'm told is
Yeah, no, it's
on
Kirby.
Jack
Yeah.
Kirby,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. That's public. Yeah. Um, yeah. The next one.
So why? I mean, I can guess why. It makes perfect sense to me. Uh,
Yeah.
but tell me why you wanted to do
I
that
um
story.
I I I really like while I was writing Crumb, I knew I wanted to write another biography. I really got in the bug and I was sort of cast and I knew I wanted to continue writing about comics and I've kind of decided that writing long form about comics is extremely satisfying for me and as you know as we sort of touched on earlier like there aren't that many great or good nonfiction books about the medium, let alone biographies. And I, I'm a sort of like a few parts. There's a few things that go into this. One is I really wanted to write another book about a cartoonist. One, two, I needed it to be a cartoonist who has the kind of presence to sustain a the interests of Scribner, is my publisher. Um, and so it needed to be of a certain level. There's, Schultz has been done, of course, and Harriman's done, and there just aren't that many cartoonists that can sustain, that can, frankly, financially, you know, sustain and advance. Um, that means I could afford to write the book and live in New York, and like all these sort of all of the complex math that goes into at this age, at least um, deciding on a project. And I've loved Kirby for a long time, and I did a show in Switzerland, which at the time was the largest retrospective in like 2010. And I'd written about Kirby a good amount, and I'd always thought, well, okay, I want to do this, and it I just think there's a lot to say about who he was and what he did that despite the fact, I mean, like Crumb, this is not like a blame, like wah wah situation. I just think there's a huge amount published about him. There's a magazine dedicated to him that's amazing. Um, but nobody's put it all together in a book, and let alone sort of woven in the cultural history. And, you know, the audience for this is sort of like the similar audience to Crumb in the sense that I want to dignify this, and in Kirby's case, this otherwise fairly anonymous artist, um, and make him human and get at what this achievement was that, yes, sure, like led to this multi-billion-dollar film industry and franchises and all that, but also just like what was this art? Like the art is unbelievably great and and nobody has ever equaled that level of vision in kind of genre material or really in comics in general, like that kind of science fiction landscape or I don't even know, mythopoetic or just this unbelievable sense of scale and action. And I just really wanted to get at that. And also, he invented the romance comic with Simon. There's so many ways in which he embodies the 20th century
No,
and
this,
does
I,
so from start to finish, really.
that's right.
From growing up poor, Jewish on the Lower East Side to inventing this patriotic superhero as a kind of stand-in for you know, stand in for America, but also the Jews. He kind of invents different parts of the American self-image and then also reflects it. So it's this sort of constant feedback loop, and it's incredible the amount of just the sheer inventiveness of it. It's like Philip K. Dick, yes, but also so many other things. And yeah, so I'm working on that now, and we'll see. It's another. It won't be 6 years, I hope. It's, I mean, he's gone, so a lot of it is right now coming up with names and estates to track down, and with the hopes that I can get a more granular sense of what life was like for some of these guys, not um, what did they think of Superman or whatever, but like what was their commute like from Long Island to Midtown? I want to know sort of what the life on the ground was, and um, we'll see if that emerges or not. But yeah,
So
that's
it won't be like a skeleton key, um, cracking the mystery of who actually created what character
no,
in in
that's
the
not.
smoking gun showing.
I mean, there will be some of that, but there is no smoking gun. I mean, and I have my own ideas about that, but I again like it's the sort of situation where the best way I want to tell a story about this guy, and parts of that story are difficult, like the who created what part, but that's just a part. And the
Yeah.
most important thing is that it's so apparent just by a glance at the career that he's just an artistic giant in the 20th century. And so let's talk about that and where he came from and how and why and that kind of stuff. And yeah, I mean, I'm excited for that. I'm doing that, and I'm doing a Dick Briefer book.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, a collection of Dick Briefer's comics with the New York Review comics. Because I've done some other books with them, and
Yeah, I just got this.
oh, the Michael McMillan. Yeah,
Yeah, it's great. This is
he's such a great cartoonist. Yeah, I was really glad. One of the nice things about not doing picture box anymore is is that I can have these, I can turn people on to things and then just get to write the introduction and not worry about the rest. Um, I still sometimes like feel that way, feel that relief, even though it's been like 10 years. Yeah, I mean, I did a show with him. I got onto Macmillan, and like so many, if we're talking about like where I come from, I learned about Macmillan like I've learned about so much from Gary Panter. And it was Gary who turned me on and probably turned most people on to Macmillan, because Michael managed to synthesize underground comics and sort of Chicago Images painting in a way that nobody else did until Gary. Um, and I did a show with him in 2012, I think, and published a tabloid collection of his work, and then well, a catalog for the show really, and wrote an essay. And then I suggested him to Lucas Adams at the New York Review, and he just totally fell in love with it, which is so great. Like it was so cool seeing his enthusiasm for it and how deep he went into it, and how much he, like I did, really just responded to Michael and his wife Diane's warmth, and how interesting. And they were very good friends with Griffith and Diane Newman. Um, so it was just really fun. And then I got to dive a little deeper in and write the introduction. And yeah, it's a hell of a book. It's
oh
such a
yeah.
it's such a he's like he's it's so rare to find somebody who's just so fluent in cartooning, but is also like an incredible printmaker. And it's all in the same visual language, but he has stories to tell, and he's telling them in different ways, and they're quite articulate stories. And I think people, if they sit with that book, I think there's a lot you can get out of it. Just a lot you can learn about. I don't know, there's just this other way of living almost, like the mountain climbing and
Hmm.
mid-century California. Like there's a lot in there to dig into. It's a hell of a book. Yeah, I'm really such a relief to see that out there. And so yeah, I'm gonna do the briefer book. But yeah, Macmillan's one of those guys that like all the underground guys spoke of with a certain amount of awe.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You can see, I mean, the guy's an unbelievable draftsman. And it also points to how forward thinking Arcade was as a magazine. Just
Right.
such a brilliant thing. But yeah, those books are fun, those sort of things. So yeah, briefer. I think that's, and then the Crumb reprints, and somehow every and this Whitney show opening in the fall, which will be fun. So
You got a
some
lot going on.
it's a bit much, but
Yeah.
it's my own compulsion. So I got to deal with it. Just
Mhm.
have to deal with it, John.